This training is currently being recorded and live streamed on our YouTube channel. All recordings of these trainings, as well as the materials provided by the panelists, can be found on our website, gerrymander.princeton.edu. You can access them on the New Mexico State page by clicking the New Mexico Redistricting Trainings link under related content. Now, I want to make sure we have ample time for presentations and Q&A, so I will offer just the briefest introduction and we'll get started from there. We will first hear from Carmen Lopez, the Senior Democracy Director for the State Innovation Exchange, about public opinion over the past few redistricting cycles. Next, John Bowler, the Senior Staff Attorney for the Legislative Counsel Service, will speak to past legal challenges in redistricting. We will then hear from Gabriel Sanchez, a professor of political science at the University of New Mexico, who will discuss a survey he conducted to shed light on what the public wants to see from this redistricting cycle. And finally, we have two individuals who have served on redistricting commissions in other states, Colleen Mathis from Arizona and Gil Ontai from California. And they'll share their experiences and insights on navigating the challenges of serving on redistricting commissions. So with that, I'll turn it over to Ms. Lopez.
Thank you, Sandra. Thank you for inviting me this evening. I will share my screen momentarily, but I just want to say a few things first. So thank you for the opportunity to share with you some of the historical trends of public opinion on redistricting. As Sandra said, my name is Carmen Lopez, and I'm the Senior Democracy Director with the State Innovation Exchange, and I'm zooming into from Santa Fe, New Mexico. I've been working in the good government, democracy, and voting and elections space for more than 20 years. The State Innovation Exchange, we support state legislators to fight better and fight differently to enact and defend policy that moves the country forward. We have state-based staff in 12 states and a national team of policy, research, and communications professionals that directly support state legislators' work to champion democracy reform. I will also say that over the past year, we have received dozens of requests from dozens of states to prepare and support state legislators through their own state's redistricting processes. This has required a bit of polling on our part, a bit of explanation about how each state's process works, and then direct assistance to state legislators to make the process better for their constituents. So for some of these reasons, I think I'm here to talk with you a bit about public opinion over the decades, specifically on redistricting. If someone can give me a heads up and let me know that you can see my screen, that would be great.
Yes, we can see your screen.
Okay, fantastic. So as I looked through the polling, both New Mexico polling, in-state polling from various places, cross-state polling, and then genuine national polling, I think there are really two types of polling that have been conducted about redistricting over the past 30 years. The first type of polling asks questions that are designed to elicit people's opinions about the redistricting process itself. And the second type of polling asks questions designed to elicit people's opinions about how the process of redistricting needs to change in the future. So in New Mexico, Common Cause has commissioned research and polling to ask spot questions over the years about redistricting. And some other state groups have done the same. And then recently there's been we've seen greater collaboration in the state to conduct more robust polling, and Dr. Sanchez will address those findings in his presentation in a bit. Collectively, the New Mexico polling and all of those other categories of polling provide some insight into what people want the redistricting process to look like. And, part of I will also say that over time, people's knowledge of the redistricting process people's knowledge has increased rather dramatically in the last several years. And the following themes have emerged. So one is that people want transparency in the process. There's concern about the self-interest of elected officials drawing maps, which that phenomenon is more commonly described as elected officials choosing their voters rather than giving voters a chance to choose their elected officials. People also have significant concerns about their ability to participate, both the lack of opportunity, their lack of knowledge, and a just genuine lack of opportunity to participate. And then the third piece that I think is really important that the polling shows is, and this sort of speaks to people's cynicism about the process, is that they want to see that their participation resulted in more representative and fair outcomes. So there are concerns from the public that testimony is provided but ignored, and that the maps that would have been created get created anyway. And what they see are gerrymandered maps or unfair maps. They're concerned about representation issues, meaning the lack of engagement of young people, sovereign nations, prisoners, Hispanos, and Native Americans. And Dr. Sanchez will speak in more specific terms about that later. Also, concerns about fairness. So splitting up communities that are logical to stay together, and maps that get created to serve some purpose other than the public interest. And so that would be partisan, it would be racial, it would be a range of issues, but essentially splitting up communities in ways that don't serve those communities. So I wanted to share a couple of recent polls that I thought were interesting to include here. So in North Carolina, so again, I'll just say that over time, voters' knowledge of the existence of redistricting and gerrymandering has increased really dramatically. The polling that I read from the early 2000s, people didn't know what redistricting was. They didn't know what it meant. Gerrymandering was not a term that was in the general vernacular. Now, and I thought this was a very interesting, stark example that gerrymandering is a pressing issue for most North Carolinians. 77% of voters are familiar with the term. Voters are in favor of a series of reforms, and half of voters say that it is a meaningful contribution to their determination about who to vote for. Michigan, that 50%, more than 50% were aware of redistricting. That's a big change from 10 years ago. And then a national poll from the I have to look and see who SPLC is, but the Southern Poverty Law Center indicated that 72% support the statement that our congressional and legislative districts for elected office should be determined by a local nonpartisan commission. There are a number of other pieces of polling that I've pulled together from our organization, from the State Innovation Exchange, Campaign Legal Center, the Brennan Center, Common Cause, UNM, the Election Law Journal, and 7 other sources that I'm not going to read out. And if you would like access to that, I can share all of those links with you. And I'm not going to linger too long here because Dr. Sanchez will get into this in much more detail. But New Mexicans believe they should have a say in the process and have ideas about how participation might look. They support the engagement of young people and tribal nations in the process, and those were called out very specifically. And they believe the process should be more transparent. It should enable more political competition, and it should be governed by new and better laws. And so what implications does all of this have for this committee? So absent legally mandated redistricting forms, this committee has the opportunity to utilize best practices to create a fair, transparent process that results in better representation for all of us in New Mexico. I think the most important piece is thinking about how this committee can facilitate participation and representation and protect communities of interest. So I think the hard work of this committee is going to be, how do we build on the census work that has been done, work from civic organizations, from public and higher education, and from local radio and other media that reach deeply into rural New Mexico and into our urban centers as well. I think that it's going to be really important to demonstrate that public input resulted in fairer and better maps than would otherwise have been created. And I would encourage you all to pay particular attention to ensuring representation of under-resourced and underrepresented communities that have been disproportionately and negatively affected by previous redistricting cycles. So young people, and the opportunity here is to build on the census work that has been done on colleges and universities across the state. When I was the deputy secretary at the higher education department, higher education institutions around the state very enthusiastically participated in the census, and that infrastructure still exists and can be utilized by this committee to reach out to folks. Also, sovereign nations. There's some background with participation from sovereign nations and how the redistricting process should work. And then Native Americans who are residing outside of sovereign nation borders and Hispano communities. And then this is a new conversation in New Mexico, but the conversation about prisoners and the counting of prisoners and the engagement of prisoners in an appropriate way, I also think is important. So there are prisoners in city and county jails, in state and federal prisons, and there have been significant problems that were created pretty consistently across the country of counting prisoners in the prisons in which they reside. And that has created an unintended consequence. So it means that like small middle-class towns are essentially, their population is being overcounted and they are being overrepresented, whereas the communities from which people come are essentially then being undercounted and underrepresented. This is a particular problem in New Mexico with the disproportionate incarceration of Native Americans first and Hispanos second. So I would ask you to think through what that means to your work, not in terms of reaching out to those folks, but in terms of making sure that that their presence is counted in their home jurisdiction and not in the place where they are residing at that particular moment. This is more commonly referred to as prison gerrymandering, and there's a tremendous amount of work that's now available to assist with avoiding the unintended consequences. And there are over 200 counties and municipalities across the country that adjust local redistricting data to avoid prison gerrymandering. And there are some statewide efforts that have been successful to ensure that prison gerrymandering doesn't happen. All of these reforms are not legally mandated in the form of an independent redistricting commission, but this does not mean that the opportunity to be attentive to all of these measures doesn't exist. So I will leave it at that and hand it over. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Ms. Lopez. And we will be hearing more about public perception challenges from Professor Sanchez, as she mentioned. But before we get there, I'd also like to have Mr. Bowler present on past legal challenges in New Mexico redistricting.
Let me unmute. Hello, good evening, everybody. I've been asked to give you a brief summary of the legal challenges in past couple of redistricting cycles. I have been an attorney here at the New Mexico Legislative Council since 1998, so I've had the pleasure of working with Brian Sandra, for instance, on redistricting in 2001 and 2011, and I guess we'll do that again this year. And you know, I struggled a little bit in approaching this subject because you know, I wanted to be useful to all of you in carrying out your task in redistricting, both the CRC and the legislature in getting plans to the governor eventually. And interestingly enough, in the past two redistricting cycles, the legislature managed to pass plans with the exception of a congressional plan in 2011 that never got out of the House or Senate. I think it was the House. And they submitted those plans to the governor for his or her approval, both in 2001 and 2011. But in both cycles, most of those plans were vetoed, with the exception of a Public Regulation Commission plan in 2001 and a Public Education Commission plan in 2011. And so basically, the case law in New Mexico redistricting efforts is confined to cases where the existing districts were by definition unconstitutional. They were malapportioned because it was the law from 10 years before. And so it was, the legal challenges were basically, these are unconstitutional. There's now one person, one vote. So in that sense, that's not terribly, and I should say that in all those cases where there were some plans, the plans that were passed, they were not challenged in court at all. So we have one New Mexico Supreme Court case, which I believe Justice Chavez is quite familiar with, and that's the sole case in the Supreme Court on redistricting, coming out of the last two redistricting cycles. And there the court stated, we emphasize that the principles articulated herein apply only to court-drawn maps. So all is not lost on those cases, though, and because I think you can still, that decision distinguishes between requirements for court-drawn plans versus those that are legislatively drawn, and that may help still give you some guidance in completing your redistricting tasks. That case, the one I mentioned, the Supreme Court case, as well as all the lower court decisions in those redistricting cycles are available on our New Mexico redistricting webpage. And I can share that with you all. I think members of the committee probably already have that, but if not, I will send that around after. And I apologize for not having that to you before we started this evening. So anyway, regardless of whether a plan was enacted by the legislature or drawn by a court, certain principles must be followed. And in fact, those principles are laid out in the CRC's requirements for drawing district plans. That's in section 13A7, NMSA 1978. And basically, these are like the guidelines that the legislature used 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, as far as sort of establishing the guardrails within which the legislature in those cases had to draw their plans. And basically, some of them are federal requirements, and starting with the one person, one vote requirement, and that and that's number it's section or subsection A, subsection A, subparagraph 1. Congressional districts shall be as equal in population as practicable. And basically that has always meant any deviation from absolute equality must be justified by legitimate state interests. And this applies whether it's a court-drawn plan or a plan drawn by the CRC or the legislature. And what that means is that, well, 10 years ago, the court approved a plan with zero deviation. All of the districts were absolutely equal, the 3 congressional districts. 20 years ago, there was a deviation of 166 people out of, I think, 1.8 million. It was a 0.03% total deviation. And so in that case, I think, it's pretty evident that you have to be very careful when you're drawing the congressional districts. What the question is what's a legitimate state interest in varying from that absolute zero, and it can be, and under the cases, and they've discussed this in these court cases too, it can be a traditional redistricting principles that may be protecting communities of interest, there's several respecting political subdivision boundaries, neighborhoods, geographic boundaries, and even maintaining existing districts or avoiding the pairing of incumbents to some degree. So all of those things can be used, but usually you can find several ways to draw those three districts with very little deviation. And if they were challenged, the court would probably tend toward the plan with the least deviation, unless you have some really good reasons to deviate from zero. The second provision in a statute, your statute, the CRC statute, is that state districts shall be substantially equal in population, and that no plans for state office shall be considered to have a total deviation of more than 10%. And while the courts held to a higher standard, that is, they have to justify deviations even if they are less than 10%. Deviations of less than 10% in legislatively drawn plans are presumed to be constitutional. Although they can still be challenged, you could have a plan that has a total deviation of 10%, and if drafters of the plan used illegitimate reasons for population disparities and created deviations solely for the benefit of certain regions at the expense of others, then you could challenge that even if you had a deviation less than 10% total. And I think that was actually one of the cases actually mentioned that one of the plans that was submitted to the court last 10 years ago had basically allowed certain rural districts, I think, to be overpopulated and underpopulated, and certain urban districts should be overpopulated as a general rule. And so it was the court saw that as discriminating against the people in urban areas, basically, because their vote was being diluted by that process. So even though the plan itself was within the 10% margin, the court said that they weren't going to look at that, or we're not going to accept that plan. And finally, the third requirement under federal law is that plans that comport with the provisions of the Federal Voting Rights Act of 1965 and federal constitutional standards. And plans that dilute or protect a minority's voting strength are unacceptable, and race may be considered in developing plans, but shall not be the predominant consideration. And traditional race-neutral districting principles shall not be subordinated to racial considerations. And basically, that provision in your statute is based on federal law and federal case law. And New Mexico has traditionally had many majority-minority districts, over 30 or 35, I think, in the House. I can't remember, Brian, but it's an equivalent percentage in the Senate. Most of those districts were drawn in the 80s and early 90s. In those districting rounds, we were under pre-clearance, in fact, in the 90s, and so it's been a long time since there's been an analysis on whether some of those districts have to be where they are, or if they have to be drawn as they've existed for 20 or 30 years. So that's an open question. And I know that the court analyzed the districts in the Senate case 10 years ago, and it said in one of its findings that all the plans before the court contain significant number of Hispanic majority districts. However, the court finds no persuasive evidence that Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act requires any particular Hispanic majority district to be drawn. So that was just that's only to the Senate plan as far as that goes, and that in that decision 10 years ago. But it does indicate that the courts may be looking at a different or be amenable to changing where Hispanic districts are, or how they're drawn, or where they're located. But again, that's an open question. And then finally, you have the other traditional redistricting principles that are in your guidelines, and the court, and that's, that you use the federal decennial census data. You shall not split precincts when you're drawing districts. That's the building block of all the districts. You have to use single member districts. That all districts shall be composed of contiguous precincts and shall be reasonably compact, and that to the extent feasible, districts shall be drawn in an attempt to preserve communities of interest and shall take into consideration political and geographic boundaries, including the boundaries of Indian nations, tribes, and pueblos. And finally, to the extent feasible, the committee may seek to preserve the core of existing districts. So those are all of the traditional sort of state interest and redistricting principles that we've used in the past. The courts are always cognizant of how when you deviate from zero population deviations in your redistricting, that you're following one of those principles and you're not subordinating other interests to in drawing of your plans. So I don't have a lot more to say about. I mean, you can get really in the weeds very quickly in reading the court decisions. I think they are instructive and they're useful, but again, be aware that that the court decisions tend to have a lot more strict interpretations of population deviation and their obligation to not have, also have a partisan effect in their plans. And you'll notice there's nothing in here about partisanship, and that's because that's not been something that's been litigated when it comes to a legislatively enacted plan. And mostly that's because there hasn't been a legislatively enacted plan that's been challenged. It's always been a lack of a plan. So with that, I'll leave you, and if you have questions or specific questions later, I'll be happy to try to answer them.
Great, thank you. And with that, we can move over to Professor Sanchez.
Thank you very much. Share screen here. Pull up a PowerPoint deck. Looks good. Everybody see it all right? Excellent. Thank you very much for having me. Good evening, everyone. I hope you are all well, safe, and healthy. I've been asked to give a little bit of an overview of a redistricting survey conducted with my team pretty recently to give you an idea of where New Mexico voters stand on some of the issues that I know you all will be tackling, and hopefully this will be helpful. I also want to know, before I jump into this survey, I'll be doing some national survey work pretty quickly, looking at different messaging approaches to try to engage the public more directly in the redistricting process. And I'll make sure as soon as we have findings, I get that to you folks in case it's useful or of interest. And finally, I want to note briefly that it looks like I will be conducting a formal evaluation of this redistricting cycle. And I would love to request down the line an opportunity to present a little bit about that project to you through public hearing. So without further ado, I'm going to jump right into it. I know timing is key, so I've cut back quite a bit on a much longer version of this deck that I can make available to you so that you can see a little bit more detail, but I'm hitting the high points and mainly, again, focusing on what New Mexico's population specifically is looking for in terms of their maps. Give you a little bit of the research design, and fortunately, as Carmen was able to tee up a lot of these issues in terms of the national polling that's been done and the landscape of that polling, I'll be able to jump right into it and hit on some of the high points. A little bit on the research design and process. You see mainly the field dates, August 4th through September 1, 2020. Just pretty recent data, gives you a pretty good vantage points of what confirmed voters in New Mexico thought about different principles within redistricting. We did this one fully on web, largely because one of the goals from the survey was not just to collect information from voters, but to provide a lot of background information and education about the redistricting process. So in the survey, folks were able to toggle onto any key terms, jump back in the survey if they wanted to read more paragraphs about different concepts or principles before we asked for their opinion. And it also gave an opportunity for folks to be able to give open-ended responses, some of which I'll paraphrase for you before I finish up. You see the margin of error, 4.3%, N of 500, was done in both English and Spanish. And at the end of the day, we weighted the data to demographics of New Mexico's registered voter population to ensure it was a representative sample. So I think some of the key principles, again, this is a short version of the deck, but I think I'm hitting on what I perceive might be of most interest to you folks as you begin your work together. And when we asked folks, essentially, which of the following best reflects your views on the political party makeup of future districts, or really trying to get at the role of partisanship in the constructions of maps, you see that the modal category at 47%, just under 50% of the full sample, lean towards making districts politically competitive, so increasing competitiveness, so that Democrats, Republicans, nor independents have a chance at winning, and no single party has any advantage. I think most political scientists like myself will say there's a lot of normative value in enhancing competition, mainly that as competition rises, so does civic engagement, political turnout, and all those good normative values. Second on that list, you see 26% say avoid considering political affiliation at all, right? Instead, drawing district lines based on just federal criteria and demographics and communities of interest, et cetera, but essentially leaving party affiliation completely out of the picture. Third, and at 14%, the population in the survey leaned toward protecting districts that have been historically Democrat or Republican. So in essence, maintaining these quote unquote safe districts for candidates from these parties. And 13% didn't have a strong opinion. Many of those folks in the open-ended response category basically said they were mixed between a couple of these different options, but the majority, just as it's reflected in the overall numbers of the open comments, suggested that political competition was the primary or dominant outcome that they would like to see through the map making process. Just to give you an idea of how this looks broken out by partisanship, and we ensured through quotas to make sure that the survey sample reflected the overall party makeup of the state. So you see the biggest difference, we actually don't see major differences in terms of Democrats and Republicans in regard to leaning toward making districts politically competitive, but you see independents jump out, particularly when we talk about avoiding considering political affiliation at all. So just taking party completely out of the mix. Somewhat intuitively, you see that nearly 70% of independents declined to state folks in New Mexico opt towards that option. Another key principle is this notion of preserving existing districts, right? And I'm sure that'll be something that you folks have to think a little bit about. You see when we provide folks a couple of different options, you see again, the modal category, this time at 57% of the sample indicated they lean toward objective criterion to draw new maps, even, and this is key, even if that means some existing lawmakers or incumbents might lose their seats or face greater competition, right? And so when we give you a couple of different quotes that were again available to all of respondents in terms of an open-ended format, you see just a few of these quotes. I usually don't like reading these to you all. I'm sure you can dig into this if you wish in your own time. But I think at the end of the day, you know, the top quote, that no partisanship or incumbency should be considered when developing districts. It's unfair to create a district specifically to elect a person from a chosen party. I would say that was reflective of most folks that took the time to give us some open-ended comments. I will say of all the different criterion that we put in front of folks in this survey, that had the most complexity, and a lot of folks in the open-end responses indicating they really didn't have a strong opinion, largely because they just didn't feel informed enough about the issue, was on whether or not lawmakers' home address should be utilized. So you see when we gave folks different options here, I'm showing you the breakout across both Bernalillo County and other areas of the state, as well as based on partisanship. At the end of the day, the distinction, if you will, between lawmakers' addresses being used or not reflects really what we heard from a lot of folks in the open-ended comments. That at the end of the day, the majority of folks, as you see, indicated slightly, right, leaning towards yes, but it was a really tossed bag. And I think it reflects the fact that of everything we put in front of folks, this is the one that they probably felt the least comfortable stating a strong opinion. We actually saw a little bit greater hesitancy in the open-ended comments to actually provide a direct response. In contrast, however, to the role of incumbent's home address, when we asked folks about the role of the public and transparency, there was much more clarity across the population. So much so, as you see here, when we asked folks, how important is it to you that all redistricting meetings be held in public, one of the measures of transparency in the overall survey, you see that almost everybody believes that it's important, 57% saying it's very important. So this notion of transparency, right, clear consensus, whether we break this out by party, rural, urban, gender, race, etc., overwhelmingly, the population of voters in the state believes that there should be enhanced transparency whenever possible through the process. When we ask folks, both in terms of their support for the public's role in redistricting, which also was very, very strong and positive in those questions in the survey, but also ask folks to give us their opinion about a bunch of different options being used in different states to try to directly engage the public in the redistricting process, you see that there was pretty strong support for a number of different issues, whether they were public hearings to accept comments on expert created and community submitted maps. And I'll say in terms of those public hearings, in the survey, we found support for whether that was done over Zoom or other virtual platforms or in person. Public hearings was definitely popular among the public, allowing the public comments online to those public maps, just basically giving people more options and venues and platforms to engage. You see that was viewed as a great idea by a large segment of the population. Webinars on redistricting to really engage and inform the population. Many of the respondents indicated in the comments that it is a complex process, and they thought that having the range of information we provided in the survey really helped them formulate an opinion. Many folks said we should think about doing something similar for the broader population through webinars. And I won't go through all of them, but as Carmen noted, when we think about engaging young people, either through student map making contests or ensuring sovereign nations are invited to give input, you see across the board, right, the majority of New Mexican voters want to see more opportunities for the public to get directly engaged in the redistricting process. And hopefully some of these ideas give you opportunities to debate putting some of this into action for this cycle. Just some comments on transparency and public involvement. Again, I don't like reading these to folks. You all can engage in this if you so desire. But at the end of the day, what we learned in the survey about this is that the electorate here in the state is hungry for seeing greater transparency in the redistricting process. And they really believe that this could go a long way to improving public trust and how district lines are drawn, right? So thinking about the past two cycles, there's a lot of discussion about, as you heard, the legal context around the last two cycles. And there's a lot of us in the academic community that perceive whenever there's a perception within the public that the courts have to weigh in on those decisions, and the legislature actually at the end of the day with the governor could not come to a conclusion. There's a perception, right, that might decrease trust among those overall systems within the state. So looking at some of these quotes, right, I think quote unquote transparency for the public is paramount to regaining the public's trust, basically to open up this opportunity with you folks to engage the public more directly is something that I think is backed by data collected by this survey and the others that Carmen was able to brief you on earlier. Then finally, we wanted to get a sense of urgency within the survey from voters in New Mexico about whether new reforms or new laws, and we actually queued an independent redistricting commission in this particular question as a means of reforming redistricting in the future. You see that overwhelmingly 93% of the sample indicated that it was important to move on this now. And you see within that overall 93%, 50% indicated that it was very important. So at the end of the day, right, I'm going to skip over those comments just looking at the clock. At the end of the day, some of the key takeaways is that although the redistricting process, as we all know, is highly complex, very technical, I think this survey provides evidence that with a lot of background information Not a lot of it being very complex, but just making sure people had the information that they needed to be fully informed. New Mexico's voters are both capable and very interested in providing their informed views on the process. And I think this survey gives lawmakers, as well as you folks, an opportunity to consider some of these new reforms that could increase competition across political races and really provide opportunities for the public to be more directly engaged in the process, and for the public to feel that transparency and essentially allowing this whole entire process to be viewed publicly obviously would enhance their confidence in the process. And although, you know, there's some variation in the survey on whether or not webinars being done in person or whether or not we utilize technology to allow folks to engage in the process, you see clearly the public has a strong desire to be engaged in the effort. And I think that's the big take-home message. And so in conclusion, congratulations. We hope that this data helps you with your efforts on behalf of our state. And I thank you very, very much for all the time and energy that you're putting into this process. We know how much it means to the state. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Sanchez. And now we'll hear from the two commissioners from other states who have participated in this process before. If we can start with Ms. Mathis. Is your connection working okay?
It is so far. So hello, can you see and hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. I'm just sharing my screen. Waiting for this to go away. There we go, slideshow from the start. Greetings from Tucson, Arizona, everyone, and thanks so much to the Electoral Innovation Lab for bringing us all together. This is therapy for me. I served as the chair of the commission in Arizona from 2011 until just recently when the new commission got impaneled earlier this year. So I love opportunities like this. And I know I have very limited time, so I'll go as fast as I can to just give you a sense of the situation here over in the Grand Canyon State. And some of you may know just from the press on some of this, but I'll try to cover some of these things just briefly, things that I think could be useful and important for you to understand. Just to talk about the origins of Arizona, similar to what you just saw in that presentation with the survey that got conducted, Arizonans weren't happy with how redistricting was handled. And this was back in 1999, 2000, and they decided to kind of go out to the public and see what people wanted from redistricting. And thanks to the three people you see down there in the corner, a Republican, a Democrat, and an independent, went into a restaurant, not a bar, and they helped draft Proposition 106, which is what Arizonans voted on back in 2000, which ultimately passed with 56% of the vote. And Cokie Roberts, I attribute that quote to her at the top. I just love it. She was writing about Arizona and saying, in a spasm of good sense, Arizonans did this. I didn't live in Arizona at the time. I'm actually from Central Illinois, but this is what happened way back when. So we've been at this now for over 20 years. And I think this is a really important thing. This is what the voters voted on when they passed independent redistricting in Arizona. And you can see, to oversee the mapping of fair and competitive districts. I think it's important to keep that in mind. Competitiveness is one of our criterion in Arizona that we have to consider, unlike, I know, New Mexico. Maybe in the future, though, based on that, 47% of the people would like to see competitiveness included. In Arizona, the rise of the independent has been enormous. I'm a political independent. And back when Prop 106 was passed, only 18% of voters were registered as independents. Now that's in the low 30s. So you can see it's changed a lot in 20 years, almost doubled. This is how our commission is set up. I actually applaud your advisory committee, your commission, in terms of how you guys are picked, because I think there could be some improvement in Arizona in this regard. Ours is set up as 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats, and an independent. The 4 partisans essentially are appointed by majority and minority leadership, and the independent is chosen by those 4 from a slate. And the slate is developed for all of the candidates by the Commission on Appellate Court Appointments in Arizona. And we're all citizen volunteers. We're not paid. Everybody filled out the same application, wrote a statement of interest, and then the Commission on Appellate Court Appointments makes the call on the slate. It's really important to hire key staff. These people are just as critical to the success of the commission as the commissioners themselves, in my opinion. Our executive director, our deputy executive director, we of course hired legal consultants. Unfortunately, independent redistricting does not take legal challenges away, but if you have really good legal counsel, you can navigate the process. We had a Voting Rights Act expert actually on our team. You heard earlier about pre-clearance a little bit from John. We were subject to pre-clearance here in Arizona fully as the entire state was for the past 30 years. And this has now changed with the Shelby County decision, of course, but it's still, you still have to comply with the Voting Rights Act. So you might want to consider having somebody who's very well versed in that. Technical consultants, of course, a great mapping firm really helps a lot. None of us were professional mappers, and so we really needed that strength. And then having a racially polarized voting analysis done as well. We did that as well as part of our legal team, and that's because of that pre-clearance requirement that we were subject to. The requirements in the state are in Arizona are very similar to what you heard from John in terms of what you're going to have to comply with. Everybody's complying with those first two across the country, no matter who draws the lines. And then that last one that you see, favor competitive districts, that's unique to Arizona. I know New Mexico doesn't have that, but it was a criterion for us, and it is considered equal to all the other criteria. And that was decided by our Arizona Supreme Court under the last round of redistricting. Anyway, so communities of interest you've heard about, because I know you guys have them and are going to need to listen to those people and try to identify the lines around what a given community of interest is. And you're going to hear a lot of testimony if you're anything like us in terms of people trying to define what their community of interest is. These are just some examples of what those could be. And then what is competitiveness, which was another big one for our commission. I want to show this map because this was the congressional district map that the first commission, Independent Redistricting Commission in Arizona, came up with. And it is very strange looking, and it is a great example of how the criteria compete with each other, because you're going to face a lot of challenges. It's one thing to know what the criteria are, but then when you actually have to go to put the pen to the paper and figure out in the computer how to figure out where to draw the lines, you'll figure out quickly that these criteria compete with each other. And a great example here is compactness and contiguousness, which you all have, with communities of interest. And if you see up in the upper right-hand corner in Arizona, you may know we have 22 federally recognized Native American tribes. And that little 2 island up there happens to be the Hopi Reservation. And at the time they came to the commission, my understanding is, I wasn't on that commission, but they came to the commission and said, we don't want to be in the same district as the Navajo. Well, the Navajo fully surround the Hopi. So how the commission could do that was a big challenge. And in terms of complying with contiguousness. So they had to figure out how to get them attached to another district. And you can see that blows compactness out of the water. I mean, this is no longer a compact district. It's wildness in terms of calculating the compactness for that district. But you're honoring and respecting a community of interest. And so that shows you how the commission's going to have challenges where they're going to be faced with these kinds of decisions. And I would say, obviously, to me, it's a no-brainer that you would honor and respect the community of interest. For my commission, let's say the commission the last 10 years, we didn't have this challenge. It turned out the Hopi were okay with being with the Navajo in this case, so we didn't have to do this. But our commission would have done the same thing, trying to honor a community of interest. So it just gives you an example of how these criteria compete, and you're going to be facing challenges like that and are going to have to come to some agreements on how to proceed. And I will say also, we did not adopt formal definitions of any of the criteria, and that was our legal counsel's advice, which I think was really great advice, it turns out, because again, we were sued. We had 5 major lawsuits against us. And when you adopt a hard and fast rule or definition around some of these criteria, people will figure out a way to get around those definitions. And so it's best to try to keep an open mind, go out and listen to the public and let them tell you what their communities of interest are. And then the commission needs to get together and figure out, okay, well, what makes the most sense here? And then try to come to agreement that way. This going out and listening is huge. And I did do some math before this meeting and learned that New Mexico is 7,592 square miles bigger than Arizona. But we have more people here in Arizona. And you're going to want to do the same thing. Go all over the state to the extent possible and have hearings in different places. I noticed you have a requirement to actually be on a Native American reservation for one of yours, which is just fabulous. We didn't have that requirement, but we did do that. And actually multiple times. And so it just brings more information to you and helpfulness, because none of us are experts on every corner of the state. And it was so great to go, actually, this was the funnest part of serving on the commission, is going out and listening to folks tell you what it is their community of interest is or what they wanted to see in the maps. It turns out, just stats wise, I would recommend you guys track this too. Pay attention to and have somebody tracking what people are saying in their testimonies in terms of which criteria are really important to them. And you can see communities of interest and competitiveness rose to the top. The beauty and benefit of these advisory committees or independent redistricting commissions is bringing the public into the equation. And to the extent you can maximize these numbers, you should hold as many public hearings and meetings as you can. And I would encourage you to have public comment at all of your business meetings, even if they're not labeled as such, as a hearing. It's really important to give people an opportunity to speak, and also to have a really good website so that people can submit their input online if desired. They can submit maps. They should be able to online, which is something we did. We also transcribed all of our meetings and posted those on our website. We also videoed all of our meetings so that people who couldn't attend could go back and watch and hear how decisions got made throughout the meeting and what input was given. So to the extent you can have a really good portal, some way for the people to supply their input, you should. These are all things many learned in kindergarten, but it turns out to be really relevant to any kind of public body, frankly. And these things are all important. And I would really encourage you guys to have open minds, because that's something that we just, as commissioners, we were surprised oftentimes of some of the testimony we received, because again, we're not experts on what everybody's doing in these big states that we live in, big geographic states. It does turn out that even if you are what you think is a good person, redistricting is super contentious. I think everybody knows that. We are independent in Arizona of the legislature and can pass maps with a 3-2 vote. We require a simple majority, and politics is not entirely removed from the process. You're dealing with a political exercise. People's, lives are impacted hugely. Everybody's impacted by redistricting. And it turns out that sometimes they aren't happy with what happens. And I was removed as chair of the commission. It only lasted, fortunately, for 18 days until the Arizona Supreme Court stepped in. But you're going to face very contentious situations in New Mexico as well. And you won't have this probably, since you have some legislative involvement on your commission, but it's still going to be contentious. And so to the extent you can try and do your best and stick to your knitting, I would say, is a key lesson I don't have on here, because people are going to be trying to distract you as commissioners or create, sideshows that really don't contribute to the advancement of maps. And so you just really need to try to put your blinders on and focus on what you're doing and what these criteria are. And all of these things are very important. get to know each other as people to the extent you can. It was very difficult for us in Arizona because of our open meeting law that we were subject to and advised by our legal counsel to essentially not fraternize with anybody, which is sad, frankly, because I think that's really the only way you can come together as a body if you get to know each other as people and understand where they're coming from. And then you can begin to say, okay, I know you and I know what your value set is and what's important to you. And let's try to, then figure out how we can work together to accommodate as much as we can of everybody's needs and wants. These are additional resources that I'd recommend if you're interested more about the Arizona story. And actually, this podcast is really good. It covers 6 states. It was done by 538 a few years ago. Arizona was one of the states covered. And then I co-authored this paper that has some lessons learned in it that I think are useful. And I like to end my presentations always with this quote from Harry Truman that I've modified for my own purposes. And I would highly advise you to get a pet of some kind that will love you unconditionally, no matter what you're going through. So with that, that's my spiel.
Thank you, Ms. Mathis. And to our final presenter, Mr. Ontai. Mr. Ontai, I think the screen you were sharing was, yeah.
Okay, can you hear me now? Hi,
Yes.
everybody. Good evening. So how much time do we have left, Sandra?
So this was scheduled to run an hour. Unfortunately, I think our training sessions have a tendency to go a little over time, so I apologize about that. I would say, I don't want to cut you short. I know if it is okay with the committee members to go a little bit over time, it'd be great to hear what you have prepared. But I do also want to respect everyone's time. So if you could keep it a little bit brief, that would be appreciated.
Okay, so my presentation is all verbal. I'll try to make it as brief as I can, but as impactful as I can as well. Colleen really went into the details, and I appreciate that. California's redistricting process pretty much followed the process that Colleen outlined. There's one piece that really stands out that makes California different, though, is that we did not have competitiveness as part of our criteria. Although the results of our maps serendipity made California one of the most competitive states in the states. So, it's an outcome of the process, and we're glad about that. So what I wanted to talk about, instead of getting into the mechanics, is the challenge of being a commissioner from the standpoint of a perception and image that you will make before the public. And there's 3 points that I think that are very important. Team building is the most critical. The 7 of you will be making crucial decisions, and what we found out in California is we had to learn more about each other's, our families, our backgrounds, our careers, and we did that with a lot of social hours, dinners and lunches, where we could, so that we got to know each other, and that was a very important part of our ability to respect and to dialogue with each other. And of course, all of these meetings we could not talk about commission business, but that's important because you want to build up trust and rapport with each of you, and it minimizes the sense of I'm here and you're there. It creates a social bonding that's really crucial. So I would encourage you to do that. And of course, stay clear of partisan decision making when you do get together. The second one is building trust amongst each other and with the public. Listen with good intent for what the citizens want. I think that was brought up many times, but that's really important. The public is really watching you. And accept the fact that there is going to be no perfect maps. There is compromise. You have to learn how to compromise, but also look for opportunities to build communities where you can, and be proactive about that. Maintain always your high standards of ethics personally and in front of the public, and as a team member as well. And the third part, of course, which has been talked about a lot, is transparency. It is a mindset in California, and I hope it is for all commissioners, that you are a partner with all citizens engaged in this process. It's not the commission's work, it's the citizens of your state's work. And you have to truly engage the public and make them feel that they are partners in this process. In California, we had all of our meetings televised in real time, so the public saw every decision we made. They analyzed how we dissected our decisions, how we incorporated our thoughts. We fought, and the public saw that. We cried, and the public saw that. And that demonstrates sincerity to the public. And that's what you want to try to create in the process that you will go through. Building that trust with the public is so crucial. Sincerity, as a public servant, I just can't underline that as much as I can promote that. Share your criteria with the public and invite them to participate. Always make the public aware that you have a set of criteria and this is what you have to follow. Invite them to use that same criteria to make decisions and give you input. The more you engage them on a common grounds from the start, it is important to build that trust. And also you're building faith in government. We held 34 public hearings, and that was carried throughout the state of California in 2 cycles, followed by 70 business meetings in which the commissioner made decisions on maps. And I think you're on your way to doing the same thing. So those are my 3 points that I wanted to share with you as commissioners, what you ought to be really focusing on as individuals and as a team. Make that image, that perception visible to the public through your actions and through your conduct. So that's my 2 cents.
Awesome, thank you very much. And so I know we've already moved past the hour mark, but I did want to give a chance for the committee members to ask questions while our panelists are all here. I know some questions have already been entered into the chat, so we can start with those. And I'd welcome the committee members to voice these questions yourselves in case they've changed or you would like to add any details. So I see a question from Ms. Curtis. I think it was partially addressed already, but if you'd like to add on to that.
Sure. For both of the prior commissioners, I just wanted to know how successful the maps were that you ended up drawing. I mean, you mentioned the 5 lawsuits, Colleen, that you guys went through, and I'm curious also for you, Gil. I mean, part of the point for us here is to save the taxpayers the money of the litigation, which has always been very prevalent following prior redistricting efforts. So I just wanted to know what your experience was with that.
Colleen, why don't you go first?
Okay, thanks, Gil. Yeah, we did have 5 lawsuits, 2 of which went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. We prevailed, the commission prevailed in all 5 suits. As I said, we have really excellent legal counsel that helped us. And the way even though it was very litigious, we did save taxpayer dollars by not having to go back and redraw maps. Our maps were upheld by the US Supreme Court, and also earlier by the Department of Justice when we had to pass pre-clearance. It was the first time in Arizona's history that we actually passed pre-clearance on both maps on the first try. And so in doing that, you really save a lot of money by not having to come back and draw more maps. So to the extent you all can get it right the first time, so to speak, that's a good way to save money.
Absolutely. I totally agree. Do it right the first time and it'll save taxpayers a chunk of money. And also you just don't want to be there as well. In California, we had 3 lawsuits immediately after we completed our maps. All 3 went to the state Supreme Court. All 3 were unanimously approved. And the basis for that was we followed our criteria strictly. We had wide public participation, and the court was emphatic in pointing out the transparency process in which how we engaged and made our decisions was all public, and on that basis, all 3 lawsuits were won by the commissioner and the citizens of California unanimously.
I would just echo what Gil said too about creating that public record. It is so important. And we learned through the US Supreme Court, they actually had their clerks reading our record to decide how we were making our decisions. So they pay attention to that. So definitely create a very detailed public record. And if you can, post it, somewhere where everybody can access it too.
And on top of that, in California, right after the court's decisions, interested parties tried to get another initiative to the state to dispel the Senate maps that we did. That went down with a public vote of confidence of 72%.
Well, that's really helpful, and some history is really helpful for us going forward, I think. So thank you both for those answers.
Great. Oh, sorry, I see Mr. Radigan, you unmuted, so go ahead with your question.
Sure, thank you. Thank you to all 5 of our speakers, really helpful information. And, I'm thinking a lot about something Carmen said at the beginning about the 3 things that are most important to the public: the transparency, ability to participate, and the outcomes. And I feel like we've developed a process where we're doing what we can towards transparency and that ability to participate. We've got the public mapping portal stood up. We've got our public meetings set where the rules are established, and we're working in a way that's trying to become as transparent as possible. So then it's the outcomes. And I think, Colleen, about the statistics you gave on the amount of input that you received. And while we have great technology to capture that, I'm still not clear on how we're going to distill all of that input and make it meaningful to us as we weigh our trade-offs. So I'm curious, Colleen and Gil, what did you do once you had all that public input? What did you do with it?
Do you want to go first, Colleen?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, Gil's is probably even a bigger deal since California is such a massive state with so many people. But we had a really great staff that compiled all of this information. We got it in, and I still have these binders. They're super thick binders of printed out paper, if you can imagine, of all the emails that came in to our commission website. And then we also, of course, have the meetings transcribed and videotaped. So as commissioners, it was incumbent upon us to review that information. And so, you didn't have to attend every single meeting, like on these hearings all around the state I showed you. Not all 5 commissioners had to be at every single meeting because we were videotaping and transcribing everything. So if somebody, if 3 of us could be at a meeting, 2 didn't have to, or something like that during those public rounds of hearings that we had. but it was incumbent upon the individual commissioner to follow up and make sure they watched. And it's kind of an honor system at that point, whether everybody did or not. But all meetings, then, all business decisions, any movement on maps was done in the public session, and all voting, of course, on anything to do with the maps was in public session. So it required a lot of work, frankly. There's a ton of time commitment that for 11 months, I would say, of the commission, at least, under the old scenario of getting the data when we got it, the census data. I know it's different for you guys. So it just, it is a ton of information that's coming at you. That's all I can say. And you just have to do your best to sift through all the input that you're getting, because oftentimes the stuff that's really important, and if there's anybody that you're giving advice to on giving testimony, it's so helpful if they can give you actual maps, like even if it's drawn, even if it's just boundaries on streets or something that ties their input to an actual line is really useful. And so to the extent people can provide you with that, you should encourage it, because it makes your job easier later.
So what we did in California, of course, it's a 30 million population state, is we actually divided the state into regions and assigned 2 commissioners to each of these regions. So as public testimony and written documents were sent in, they were compiled within those districts, and the 2 commissioners were responsible for that particular region to filter that data and to compress it into meaningful reports, which we verbally gave to the business meetings that we've had. So that cut down and made it far more manageable for us to navigate all the data and information that we received.
Helpful, thank you.
I have a few questions. Colleen and Gil, based on your experience, I'd like to know how you as a commission reached out to the public to solicit their support, to invite their participation during the meetings, to comment online, etc.
A great question. Yeah. Gil, do you want to go first?
Ed, could you say that again? I caught part of it.
And my question is, what community outreach did you as a commission do to energize the public to participate in your meetings, to comment on websites, etc.?
Got it. So we were fortunate to have a number of nonprofit organizations who, from the very beginning, League of Women's Voters, the Common Cause, the Irvine Foundation, that pumped in a lot of money to reach out to various communities throughout California, particularly underserved communities. So Irvine Foundation put almost $1 million behind reaching out to culturally sensitive organizations, to benchmark leaders, church leaders, to get communities to participate from day one in the public hearings, and also in participating in providing information. So that was very unique to California, and that public sector nonprofit organization really helped us. We started off in a very compact manner. We had only 7 months to put our maps together. The commission was formed almost immediately. And so without the help of these nonprofits, we probably would not have been as successful reaching out to communities of interest.
And just to add on, we in Arizona, we hired up, this is where the staff really came in to really help us get the word out. We had a public information officer that we hired, whose job it was to kind of engage the press and make sure that places like radio stations and media knew about when our meetings were going to be occurring. We, of course, posted that on our website so that the public had advance notice of where these meetings were going to be and how they could participate. And then again, having that really good website where they could be, have access to us. Just they could submit their testimony online if they didn't want to come to an actual meeting to give it in person. So, but I would say that's the staff really is how we were able to get the word out on these different meetings, and they actually were the ones who secured the locations of where the meetings would take place.
Do you know offhand what your budget was for that?
The budget to do that?
Yeah.
Great question. That was something, the budget overall for Arizona was always contentious because we always had to go back hat in hand to the legislature, which was of course adverse to us. So the whole thing was crazy and we had to keep going back for more and more money because they would only give us a little bit at a time. And that was also part of our staff's job, is to go convince the legislature to give us money. I don't have a number as to what that cost to set up all those meetings around the state. I don't know if that's outlined in our budget. There may be a document online that I could find and follow up with through Sandra or something and see if there's anything that actually tells us, like for round one hearings, like approximately what that cost. We were all reimbursed as commissioners to drive to these places around the state. We of course got mileage reimbursed, but we tried to secure places that didn't charge, like schools and, community centers. So that kept the cost down.
Thank you.
That is a good question, though. It's really important to reach out to hard to reach communities. We were fortunate again to have the Irvine fund this, but we were successful in reaching out to tribal leaders, African American communities, Latino communities, because we went right to those community leaders and got them engaged from the get-go. But we didn't have the funds for that. That was all provided by nonprofit organizations.
Thank you. Carmen, I had a question for you. You mentioned something about the need to reach young people and how you're doing it through higher ed. I kind of missed that, but I do think, other than social media, that we really have to make a concerted effort to reach the young population. So would you mind just emphasizing that point for us?
Sure. So there were teams that were formed at each of the higher education institutions in New Mexico. And they were, I'll have to go back and look at what the names of those teams were, but they were designed to do outreach related to the census. So there was a toolkit that was designed for them. There was some back and forth about what kind of protocols to use. But that was all developed at the encouragement of the governor, but there was no funding that I know of that was made available to them to do that. So those team structures could still be utilized. Think about how deeply higher education institutions reach into the state. If you think about all the branches, if you think about the 4 years, if you think about, there's some pretty good reach just through the higher education institutions. In addition to that, there was outreach about the census through the public education system. So there were materials. There was a gentleman at the higher education department, Nathan Mokino, who coordinated the census response from a number of higher ed institutions, and then also from Pueblos, tribes in the nation. He would be a wonderful person to reach out with and utilize his network and his knowledge, his incredible relationships with tribal leaders across the state, and then also with those census groups that were formed. He was really the person who did that. There were a number of community organizations that were also helpful in the census hard to reach groups, and those groups are still, they're still in the mix, and they, it was Common Cause, League of Women Voters, Center for Civic Policy, the Native American Voters Alliance, Justice Chavez, you know, the gentleman who's the civil rights officer for Navajo Nation. You know, so there's all these networks, all these pre-existing networks that can be tapped for this purpose. I mean, there's no way that this small group of people can reach into, you know, every county in the state, or every community in the state. But if you know, if you can figure out how to utilize the pre-existing networks, then you can do that. And there are funders in the state who care deeply about the engagement of hard to reach communities. And so, you know, hopefully those folks have saved money in their budgets to help with this. Because I think there's a whole lot of care and concern across the state from funders and nonprofits and community leaders, that everybody's presence gets counted and accounted for, and that fair maps get drawn that are good for communities. So I think there's a lot of infrastructure there for you all to build on, and I'm happy to be helpful with those connections with the higher ed, community, public ed, you know, et cetera.
Thank you. Robert, Lisa? Hey, I've got a few more questions, but I want to give you an equal opportunity.
You go ahead, Chair. I'm all ears.
Yeah, John Bowler. I was interested in knowing that I know the party settled all the districting issues in 2011, other than the House. Did they adopt any of the maps that were actually passed by the legislature?
They did pass, let me think. I think it was the State Education Commission. I have my notes here, sorry.
Right, that wasn't litigated though, right?
Right, yeah. Oh, you're saying, did the courts adopt any of the plans?
The courts or the parties?
I mean, they all submitted to those plans in various forms to the courts, yes. But I think all of them were modified in some manner by the time the court got through in each of the cases, because I know in the Senate they did a joint plan. In the obviously, you know, the House, you're familiar with that one. The PRC, I think they did a they did a substitute plan there also with the from the 3 or 4 of the plaintiffs. It tended to be groups of plaintiffs that would come together at a certain point in several of those cases.
Okay, thank you. Professor Sanchez, you mentioned evaluating our commission. Are you prepared to tell us about the criteria for evaluation at an August 2nd meeting?
I will note Professor Sanchez let me know that he has a bit of background noise, so he might try to follow up over email rather than jump in. I'll give him a chance now if if he wants to join, but he might be following up over email instead.
Hopefully it's not too bad, but yes, I think August 2nd may be feasible. We're currently scoping out what the actual research design will look like, and I would love to have that fully in place so that when I present it to you that there's no changes. So I'll work as fast as I can to make that August 2nd date, but if it's not that one, it'll be one soon after. Thank you very much for that question and opportunity.
Thank you. And Colleen and Gil, were your commissions evaluated?
By evaluated, do you mean just by just any independent entity, or?
I'm not exactly sure, you know, how the evaluation came about, but apparently we're going to be evaluated. And so I just wondered if you all were evaluated, and if so, what criteria you were evaluated on.
Interesting.
I mean, formally evaluated, not, you know, people trying to kick you off the commission.
Yeah. Yeah, in Arizona, they take a hands-on approach. Overall, I mean, I think a great metric of our commission was the fact that we got both maps done on time and ready for use by the 2012 elections. I mean, having those maps ready to go, pre-cleared by the DOJ and and all set, and then lasting all 10 years through, the rest of the decade, to me was a great measure of, our success. I would stand on that, as well as the fact that we passed pre-clearance on both maps on the first try, which had never been done in Arizona. So those two things, I don't know to the extent you can use those metrics in your mind in terms of when you're going to get evaluated. But to me, not having court-drawn maps is a win, and the fact that the maps survived all 10 years. So those are two ideas, but we weren't formally, I don't think, evaluated by any group that I'm aware of.
Thank you. Gil?
Yes, we were evaluated by a number of academic institutions, but the one that we're most proud of is the Public Policy Institute of California, which does national evaluations of all these commissions. And they determined that our maps were 74% more competitive than all 50 states. So that was a very, very good big plus. But the second one is that the public approved our legislature after our maps. It was a poll that was taken in 2014, where the public voted 60% favorable of our legislation. Prior to our maps, that percentage, prior to 2008, was 8% of the public's confidence in our legislation. And we attribute that to a legislation that, through our maps, made our state legislature non-messy. It was a gridlock before. We were going into bankruptcy. We couldn't keep up with the retirement fund, where our bond rating was going up. We were in a mess because of Sacramento gridlock. After our maps were completed, we were completely reversed of that. So we're very happy to know that. And the public has given the public confidence in our maps. Today, 30% of our maps are more competitive than they were a decade ago, 2 decades ago, where only 5 districts turned over in the decades before out of 765 elections. And that's a huge change.
Congratulations. Yeah, it sounds very positive. I'm in favor of evaluations, and I believe in public constructive criticism. I think it makes our democracy better. I just wondered what your experience was. So thank you very much. Those are all the questions I have.
Great. Just one last call for any questions. All right, then with that, thank you everyone for your,
Real quick, I'm just gonna say, so Gil and Colleen, if we have other questions, the commissioners, just about common experience, is it okay if we reach out to you?
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Okay, thanks. And I really appreciate all of you today and all the effort put into teaching us how to get this done effectively. So thank you.
Great presentation by all of you. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having us. Best wishes to all of you.
Thanks for having us.
Great. So yes, thank you everyone for your time, to the presenters and the committee members. We do have one more training session that's planned for next Wednesday, July 28th, at the same time. That will be more on the technical side of redistricting in terms of metrics for analyzing maps, and we'll be in contact with more details about that session. But with that, that wraps up this training session. So I hope everyone has a good rest of your night. And thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Sandra.
Thank you.